Saving the Rohingya. Aung San Suu Kyi says she will skip the UN General Assembly meeting after international condemnation over atrocities in Myanmar. But is it time for words to be transformed into action? I'm Govt, and today's newsmaker is Aung San Suu Kyi. Myanmar's government spokesman says Aung San Suu Kyi has perhaps more pressing matters than attending a UN meeting in New York. According to them, they're facing a terrorist threat. But human rights groups are piling up their criticism against Suu Kyi, saying her government is committing ethnic cleansing. Already 370,000 Rohingya have fled the violence in Rakhine State as the civilian death toll climbs. So how can Suu Kyi ignore her peers in the international community? Well, maybe it's because they're not doing that much to hold her to account. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have condemned what they call inaction by the UN Security Council. And there are reports that if a resolution was introduced, both China and Russia would veto it. Sandra Gatman has more.
They're known as the most persecuted people in the world, and their circumstances have just taken a horrifying turn. In the last 2 weeks, hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims have escaped from the northern state of Rakhine in Myanmar. Accusations are piling up against the government of failing to stop the burning of villages, murder and rape of civilians. Even landmines have been found near the border.
There are landmines, and they keep blasting every day. Today I took my son. To see my son injured was very difficult for me.
But despite all the evidence, is the world prepared to act? In neighboring Bangladesh, about 400,000 Rohingya have taken shelter in makeshift camps. They're in desperate need of aid. But the government sees the Rohingya as illegal immigrants and says Myanmar should take them back.
These people, they belong to Myanmar. Hundreds of years they are staying there. How they can deny that they are not their citizens?
China and India are also concerned about the rising numbers of Rohingya refugees. And both countries officially back Myanmar's security crackdown to bring what they call peace and stability to Rakhine State. Beijing's foreign ministry spokesman has said, "We hope order and normal life there will be recovered as soon as possible." As for the United Nations, it stopped short of labeling the violence genocide, but it does call it ethnic cleansing, which is not considered a crime under international law.
Because Myanmar has refused access to human rights investigators, the situation remains or seems a textbook example of ethnic cleansing.
This week, the Security Council is holding a closed-door emergency meeting to discuss a way forward. But will China and Russia veto UN efforts to publicly condemn or sanction Myanmar? And is the rest of the world willing to pull out investment, just as Myanmar was opening up for global trade? Myanmar says it's hunting terrorists belonging to the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army who've killed dozens of police officers. But analysts say the group may only be a few hundred fighters strong and could easily be wiped out by Myanmar's powerful army. The question is whether there's political will to stop driving out the Rohingya. It's no secret that anti-Rohingya sentiment is common in Myanmar, and is one theory as to why Aung San Suu Kyi, Myanmar's leader, has denied the atrocities. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from London by Thomas McManus. He was one of the authors of Countdown to Annihilation, Genocide in Myanmar. In Beijing, Xu Qinduo, he's the senior radio host for China Radio International. And covering the UN meeting in New York, journalist William Denslow. Thanks all of you for joining us. Thomas McManus, let me begin with you. Aung San Suu Kyi not going to New York, not going to face the music as they debate Myanmar at the General Assembly. She says they're fighting terrorists back home. Did you expect anything different?
No, I didn't expect anything different. They've been using, the state in Burma has been using this cover of terrorism for the last 10 days now to perform their clearance operation, as they call it in Burma. I mean, if we go back, Aung San Suu Kyi was democratically elected as the de facto leader of Myanmar. And the mandate under which she was elected on, you know, supported by the international community to get her into this position, was a mandate of human rights and democracy and freedom for all. So we would have expected her to speak out for the Rohingya a long time ago. And instead, we see her asking foreign diplomats not to use the word Rohingya, so denying them their identity, which is a right under international law. And eventually we get to the stage we are now, where people are starting to see that she's spent her political capital. Right. That everything she's built up over the years is now, you know, gone.
But you said, you know, elected, democratic mandate, elected on a sort of mandate of, or platform of human rights and so forth. But we've also seen protests in Yangon supporting the government, supporting what's going on in Rakhine State. So would you accept that there might be majority support for the military and for the government in terms of what they're doing in Rakhine State?
There might be support, but we have to say Aung San Suu Kyi is a moral leader for Burma. And if she was to come out and say something, the people support her. And if she was to come out and say something, I'm sure they would go along with her. She could explain the situation in detail, explain the restraints she's under. And I've talked to people on the ground in Burma. They follow Aung San Suu Kyi wherever she goes, whatever she says. If she was to say something, she would get the support.
Right. For many people, for many Rohingya, they might see this as a victory, a small victory, given that they're talking about it in New York, or they're even planning to talk about it in New York. Because I remember, you know, months ago, Rohingya activists saying nobody cares about us, nobody knows about us, and so on. Let me bring up what Myanmar's National Security Advisor Thong Thun said regarding the possibility of this going to the Security Council. He said, we're negotiating with some friendly countries not to take it to the Security Council. China is our friend and we have a similar friendly relationship with Russia, so it will not be possible for that issue to go forward. Once again, the kind of cynicism of the permanent members of the Security Council can be criticized here. Is that confidence, Will Denslow, warranted? Is that how it's expected to play out if it goes to the Security Council?
Yeah, well, the message from the British ambassador to the United Nations, Matthew Rycroft, who stated that the fact is that when the United Nations Security Council met just a few days ago behind closed doors to discuss this very topic, when he was questioned whether the Security Council could do further, whether they were doing enough, Rycroft told reporters that the fact that the Security Council came together and discuss this was a message in itself. So that's very much a message from Security Council members. Rycroft stating that all member states condemned the violence, urging an end to what we're seeing as an escalation in violence. But of course, as you mentioned, very unlikely, and Rycroft saying himself when he spoke to the press publicly, unlikely the United Nations Security Council would go further, considering, as you mentioned, that strong and very clear position coming from the likes of Russia and China that, of course, as you mentioned, have veto-wielding powers at the UN.
Right. Xu Qinduo, the UN Secretary-General, calling this a humanitarian catastrophe. The UN Human Rights Chief, Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, calling it a textbook example of ethnic cleansing and a cruel military operation. In the face of great evidence of atrocities taking place in Rakhine State and these now hundreds of thousands of people on the move, why is China backing Myanmar? Xu?
Well, if you want to really solve this problem, you have to talk to the Myanmar government. You have to be realistic. I think Aung San Suu Kyi is being realistic. She said that I'm a politician. She's not in the position of the human rights activist or peace activist. She's the de facto leader of Myanmar. She has to take care into consideration of the views of the majority or absolute majority of the people in Myanmar. And China supports their efforts to maintain peace and stability in this country and also this region.
If the majority wants to ethnically cleanse a minority, if the majority wants to ethnically cleanse a minority, should we just accept that because the majority wants that?
No, I don't think the majority, they want to ethnically cleansing this Rohingya people. But at the same time, there's a strong hostility toward Rohingya people in Myanmar. That's basically the reality, and I think even the military government and also the the National League of Democracy, the party of Aung San Suu Kyi, basically they agree with each other. I suspect Aung San Suu Kyi herself believed in that. So that's probably why she remained silent. She talked very little about that. She supported her government's action in the Rakhine state.
Okay, so let me ask you, Thomas. You know the story better than most. Does she maybe want to help, but she's hamstrung and she can't help? Or does she not care, and does she actually want to see the Rohingya people out of her country? Which one is it?
If you asked me this question 4 years ago, even 3 years ago, I would have said, well, we're not sure, Maybe she wants to help. Maybe she's constrained by politics. We've gone well beyond that point now. We can only assume that Aung San Suu Kyi is now part of the problem, that she is herself going out saying that these horrific reports that we're seeing come out of Rakhine State, Aung San Suu Kyi saying that there's an iceberg of misinformation. She's actually providing cover, using political capital, providing cover for the military against the international community so that the military can continue their operation. And how many more days do they need?
Can I offer
people
something
leaving a day at the moment?
More information about that?
Come in, sure.
If you read, there's a report published by the International Crisis Group in 2016. The report talked about this coming into being of a new, basically, a terrorist group by the name of Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, who launched an attack on the army post and the police post on August 25th. And then there's a counterinsurgency crackdown by the government. Then that's the start of the latest round of crisis.
Right. No, certainly. And I read the report. Hold on. Just a second, Thomas. I'm going to give you a chance. I read the report, Shu. We also had the author of the report on, and she told us quite unequivocally, ARSA is a small minority of fighters who don't popularly represent the vast majority of those people who are on the move fleeing to Bangladesh, and that the longer this situation continues, it might be, and this is a worry, and this was at the crux of the International Crisis Group report, there's a worry that the longer these people are repressed, maybe more people might join ARSA. But ARSA, according to the author of the report, we had her on the show last week, she said that Myanmar's government is using this as a pretext to crack down on the Rohingya and to get rid of them, because since 1982 they didn't consider them citizens, and they're using it as a useful pretext. Would you accept that, Shu? We need to look at these things.
It's not even a convincing pretext. We're talking about the deaths of 20 security forces and the disproportionate response of removing all the Rohingya from the state. It's not even a convincing pretext.
Okay, so Shu, would you understand that when we mention ARSA, we have to put it into context and we have to look at proportionality here?
Yes, if you look at the ground, of course, we see the Rohingya people, especially children and women, fleeing that country. Obviously, there's a problem, probably excessive use of force, and you do see deep displacement of people. But as the government of Myanmar said that there's this displacement of civilians on both sides. There are also Buddhist people. Probably the proportion is different. But you can see the civilians probably joining the two sides against each other, not only the government forces against ARSA. So this is a really chaotic situation because of the lack of access of media. I'm not sure there's a clear picture, like how many people involved, how many
but when we talk about lack of access of media,
when we don't have an exact number.
Certainly, when we talk of lack of access of media, it's Myanmar's government itself that's not letting the media in. Nevertheless, let me move on to Will. Will, at the moment in New York, politically speaking, who's willing to do the most for the people of Myanmar? We talk of the cold, kind of harsh geopolitical realities. It's unlikely that anyone wants to go to war on behalf of the Rohingya. But who's doing the most and who's making the most noise right now, Will?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, we've heard these incredibly strong messages coming from Zeid Ra'ad Al Hussein, the chief of the human rights wing of the United Nations, really urging the international community to do more, that immediate action is needed, calling on Bangladesh, as far as the United Nations are concerned, to remain good neighbours, as the Security Council have put it. Of course, the message from the Security Council is that for the last year or so, they've once again reiterated they want to see Myanmar, the government there, reassert and commit to Kofi Annan, of course, the former United Nations Secretary General's plan, which really sees them, they want to see the government there stop restricting movement as well as citizenship for Rohingya citizens there in the country. That's a clear message from the United Nations Security Council. But I think, interestingly, on the topic of how Aung San Suu Kyi is being received, of course, we've heard these messages from aid groups, but a very interesting message, again, coming from the United Nations Security Council, coming from Matthew Rycroft just a few days ago. He said, speaking to reporters, that Aung San Suu Kyi had a great number of friends around the Security Council. He himself saying that the Security Council had a great deal of admiration for her from afar. So very interesting to see how the United Nations Security Council will come out. Of course, they're meeting today to discuss this once again behind closed doors. Rycroft calling for a public statement. Very interesting to see whether that position on the subject of Aung San Suu Kyi would have softened in any way, shape or form.
Right. Thomas, in addition to China and Russia, Thomas, let me just add something to it. In addition to China and Russia,
sure,
you had Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi last week showing that admiration towards Aung San Suu Kyi and pledging his country's support to her in her fight against what he called extremist violence. What do you make of that?
Well, Aung San Suu Kyi has built up this political capital over the years. You know, we campaigned for here in London for her release for many years, and she has built up this admiration. And it's frankly misplaced, and it's been used as a smokescreen to protect the military in carrying out this operation. And it's interesting, the United Nations Security Council, it is tasked with maintaining international peace and security. This is an international peace and security issue. You raise the issue of people not wanting to go to war over this. Muslim countries in the neighbouring regions, their citizens are very angry about this, and there's a lot of pressure coming down on the military. But why, for instance, if we look at China, why do they not want to get involved? Why would they veto a resolution as we understand they would? We have to look at China's interests in Rakhine State directly and generally in the country itself. The Shui gas pipeline goes through Rakhine State, goes through the areas that are populated by Rohingya. And also the mining concessions that have been given to the Chinese government over the past 5 years. They complained back in 2013 that a lot of these concessions were populated by Rohingya, and how were they supposed to get to the resources? We have to take these issues into account as well.
Shu, is it about money for China?
Well, you have to, if you want to take all the factors into account, you see like China earlier this year basically offered to mediate this problem between Bangladesh and Myanmar. China offered again basically to Aung San Suu Kyi to help basically reconcile, reconcile between the central government and also ethnic groups basically in the bordering area with China and other countries. So but China is working very hard to maintain peace and stability because that's the interests of China, that's the interests of India and also Bangladesh.
But isn't that at the crux of it? Because if you're Rohingya, you don't believe you're Bengali. That's what the Myanmar government calls you. Why would you need China to negotiate, to mediate between Bangladesh and Myanmar if you consider yourself a citizen of Myanmar and you happen to be ethnic Rohingya Muslim? You see what I'm getting at here, right? Why would Bangladesh need to be involved?
Because obviously the ARSA, the Rohingya people, are seen as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, and also they fled from previous flight basically to Bangladesh. There are still 2 refugee camps based in within the territory of Bangladesh. Bangladesh is demanding the return of those refugees back to Myanmar. Obviously, there's a problem between Myanmar government and Bangladesh. China is trying to negotiate a peace solution between the 2 countries.
Let me ask you, Thomas, we had last week Nyo On Mint on the show, former member of the NLD, close ally of Aung San Suu Kyi. When I posed a lot of this stuff to him, Thomas, he told me, actually, this is all untrue. And he said, there isn't any killing taking place. And if there is, he suggested, actually, if there is a genocide, it's happening the other way around. He said that the Rohingya are committing genocide against the other ethnic groups in Rakhine State. Thomas, as somebody who knows the story very well, is he an outlier, or is this something that's that's very prevalent and it's part of the mainstream narrative in Myanmar? Because I found it personally very shocking that he could say that and believe it.
This is part of the mainstream narrative. This is government policy, to deny that anything's happening. Then we show them videos and pictures, and they deny that it is what we are looking at is what we are seeing. I mean, it is quite stark, and I'm not surprised that you're shocked by some of the statements coming out of the Burmese government. If you have a look at the Facebook pages of Aung San Suu Kyi's spokesperson, official Facebook pages, some of the denials that are coming out are just, frankly, beyond belief, unsophisticated at best. We have people pretending to be Muslims, burning down houses, posing for pictures, wearing tablecloths as if they were Muslim headdress. I mean, it's actually got to the stage of ridiculous. And this denial is part of the state apparatus policy, and what it is doing is providing cover, providing time and space for the military to complete their operation. And be aware that the objective of this operation is to either remove the Rohingya, and they do it either by terrorizing them out of the country or by killing them. They'll use both methods. But the idea is to remove them from Rakhine State, and so we are looking at a genocide, and we're looking at a government completely in denial and denying what they will already know to be true.
We'll continue to follow this story closely. Gentlemen, I've got to move on. So I thank you very much for joining us, Thomas McManus, Shu Kindwo, and Will Denslow. Thanks again. In a moment, Burundi's ambassador to Turkey joins us to discuss UN accusations that his government is committing crimes against humanity. And could a political crackdown in Saudi Arabia lead to a new king? We debate the future of the crown. Welcome back to the Newsmakers. A UN investigation says Burundian officials at the highest levels of government should be held accountable for crimes against humanity. The violence was sparked when President Pierre Nkurunziza announced he'd run for a third term, a decision that enraged his opponents who called it unconstitutional. What followed were mass protests, and according to the UN, they were met with extrajudicial killings, arbitrary arrests and detentions, acts of torture and sexual violence. In a moment, Burundi's ambassador to Ankara will join us in the studio to respond to these accusations. But first, this report from Randolph Nogel.
Burundi's President Pierre Nkurunziza has styled himself as a leader who marches to the beat of his own drum. One many say is out of lockstep with the will of his own people. But on the streets of Bujumbura, it can seem otherwise. Nkurunziza's government has called for regular weekend protests against a UN probe into human rights violations and war crimes. Some who have taken part have said they'd be forbidden from working in the capital if they refuse to attend.
The Commission reached the conclusion that a certain number of serious human rights abuses have been committed in Burundi since April 2015. Among these violations are found to be arbitrary arrest and detention, acts of torture, and inhuman degrading treatments, execution, rapes, and other sexual violence, as well as forced disappearances.
Now the UN inquiry has confirmed what many have long suspected, that crimes against humanity have been committed by Nkurunziza's government. Armed opposition groups are also accused. But the UN says state forces are responsible for most of the atrocities.
The government of Burundi believes that this report is biased, manipulated, politically oriented, and therefore unacceptable. The government therefore requests the United Nations Security Council not to give any credit to these politically motivated recommendations.
Investigators were not allowed to enter Burundi. They conducted interviews in neighboring countries, where hundreds of thousands of people have fled. The violence started in April 2015, when the country's constitutional court allowed Nkurunziza to run for a third term. Opposition parties say his re-election violated a two-term limit, set out in an accord that brought to a close the civil war that ended in 2006. Some worry the current conflict could reignite ethnic tensions between Hutus and Tutsis, the driving force behind the war and genocide that left 300,000 people dead. With a number of failed attempts at dialogue, and Nkurunziza suggesting he could run for a fourth term in 2020, many here fear the seeds of a new crisis are being sown in a land fertile for conflict. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, I'm joined now by Joel Nkurabagaya, Burundi's ambassador to Turkey. Sir, it's a pleasure having you on The Newsmakers. I read the UN Human Rights Council's report that they presented to the General Assembly. Yes. They say your government has committed crimes against humanity. Do you accept that?
Of course, no. Of course, no. The Human Rights Council and the UN experts are trying always to, to make many different accusations. But anyway, you may know that since 2015, violent demonstrations, which have been followed by the coup attempt, the Human Rights Council and the UN expert released several reports, and these reports are exactly false, are the fake report, because
you reject them all?
We reject absolutely.
Did you read the report?
Yes.
I mean, my jaw dropped, right, when I read the second paragraph of it, when it said the Commission can confirm the persistence of extrajudicial executions, arbitrary arrests and detentions, enforced disappearances, torture and cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment, and sexual violence in Burundi since April 2015. Most of these violations committed by members of the National Intelligence Service, police, the army, the youth league of the ruling party, commonly known as Imbonerakure. I mean, this is in the second paragraph. It just basically puts it all out there. I mean, there's the report. You can have a look at it, right? You can see why. When I read that second paragraph, I go, this is incredible. This is powerful. They're saying all these unspeakable things happened, and guess what? Nearly every lever of state was involved.
Yeah, it's the same as all Burundian people. We are very, very, we don't understand why these UN experts.
But why all Burundian people? Maybe it's just the government because you're being accused.
Why? No, not only the government. When you see, as a citizen, when you see things like this, you cannot...
but they interviewed your citizens, more than 500 of your citizens who have fled. So they are 500 from among more than 400,000 who fled the country across the border. They interviewed these people. They spoke about rape, about torture. And point 14 in that report, and you can look at it afterwards, it says the victims were invariably opponents or perceived to be opponents of Pierre Nkurunziza.
The good news is that even those Burundian refugees who fled the country during this illegal demonstration, they are now coming back. And they do that more quickly than it was expected. Why? Because they see that all what is being spread by UN experts is just...
Why would they want to spread lies about you? What's in it for them? What do they gain out of lying about Burundi?
Because, these people who have been involved in these violences in 2015, and then they fled the country. They are now hosted in some foreign countries. These people try to work with the members of UN experts.
But these are people. I mean, the people interviewed are not people in Western countries. They're people usually in camps across the border in neighboring countries. They're people who've lost everything. I mean, surely as a politician representing your country, you would have some sympathy for somebody in a camp who says, I was raped, I was tortured. You'd give them the benefit of the doubt that they're telling the truth, right?
You know, let me say the following. The government of Burundi, of course, regret that such situation took place in our country.
So did some crimes happen?
Such kind of situations. Regret that in our country we had this illegal demonstration, that in our country we had a coup attempt.
Sure.
And after that, following this situation, people began to flee the country.
Okay, but
it is
what's more
really
likely,
regrettable for the country.
But a lot of them didn't just flee the country. Terrible things happened to them, and then they fled the country. They saw people being executed. They were tortured. And they name government security services.
Of course, you know who was killing the people?
Who?
The same people who fled the country.
Yeah, but it's saying that the victims were invariably opponents. Why would they kill opponents?
If you give me the chance to show you the images of people who were burned,
sure.
you know, you will just, you know,
okay,
it's incredible.
But let's look at the timeline, right? Okay, so you have your country, you have President Nkurunziza, he wants to run for a third term. It creates political instability. You have supporters and you have opponents. Fine, right? There's a divisive election. There's a failed coup attempt, right?
Mm-hmm.
Democratically elected government, failed coup attempt. Mm-hmm. Creates more chaos, terrible things happen, crimes are committed, and now in the year 2017, he has an opportunity. The United Nations Human Rights Council goes and interviews refugees across the border. The refugees speak of terrible things that happened. What's more likely? That timeline makes sense and that terrible things happened, and maybe it's an opportunity now for the government to say, yes, crimes were committed and we need to fix this, or to play the conspiracy card and say the UN is making up stories about it?
You know, this is exactly the reason why we why our government rejected this report. Why? Because why they only work on information, false information that they get from refugees, from other people who are involved in these violences.
The report says there was no cooperation from the government of Burundi. That's why they couldn't go into the country.
You know, as I told you,
yes,
the UN experts or the Human Rights Council released several reports. And in 2016, for instance, another report has been released. And this, before it came out, the government really cooperated as it was
So why did you stop cooperating with them?
But what happened?
Because you didn't like what they put in the report.
I'm sorry?
Did you stop cooperating with them because you didn't like what they were putting in the report?
No, you know, the cooperation, the government of Burundi is always committed to cooperation.
They say there's no cooperation.
Yeah, it's committed to cooperation. Why, when we cooperate with them, they don't exploit the information that they get from official?
That's a good question, and I'd like to. I'd love to actually ask the UN.
Because if you take a look quite carefully on this report, there is a single space for at least a balanced information.
Yes, but they're saying that you weren't cooperating with them. That's why they interviewed more than 500, usually in the refugee camps. Let me ask you first, do you have nothing to hide?
We don't have nothing.
Okay. Now the ICC wants to investigate potential crimes against humanity that happened during this period between 2015 and 2017. Will you allow them to investigate fully, and will you accept their findings after they investigate?
You know, I can tell you one thing. You may know, maybe you don't know, in 2016, for instance, our government already released, provided more than enough information to ICC. Mm-hmm. Information about some cases of crimes. this is, again, a good willingness from our government to cooperate. And after that, you know, now Burundi, you may know that is no longer member of ICC.
Right.
So if you are no member of ICC, how
but that's a technicality.
ICC can come and
that's a technicality, right? It's like saying, you know, oh, if we're not a member of the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, you can't investigate us for nuclear weapons. It's a technicality. But I'm asking you sincerely. Let's put the legalities of it aside. You're pulling out, there's still a little window of room for cooperation with the ICC before you formally leave the International Criminal Court. Will you fully cooperate with them if you have nothing to hide, so that they may come out and say, okay, actually it's not as bad as it seemed. Maybe the government has a point. Will you fully cooperate? Because if you don't cooperate, we go back to the beginning and you say, oh, they only interview the other side, they don't interview us.
You know what is very, very surprising? Why always they think that our justice cannot do the same job they are doing
because
today.
The people...
Let me explain one thing.
But maybe because when you read this report, it says that those in control of the levers of justice committed the crimes.
Let me tell you one thing. You know, since 2011, our government implemented a National Independent Commission on human rights.
Yes.
And this commission is in charge in the area of, you know, investigating and prosecuting prosecution of crimes, if any, you know. But all this for the UN expert, it is nothing.
Okay, but if there's claims that the National Intelligence Services, the National Police Force, military officials, and members of the youth wing of the ruling party have committed crimes against humanity, and this is not just me saying crimes against humanity, it's a legal term, you would know, right? Certain acts that are deliberately committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack or individual attack directed against any civilian or an identifiable part of a civilian population. So it's a big thing, and the government is being accused. When the government is being accused, would you accept that it's not just the ICC, but the world would think maybe the government investigating itself might not be the most credible way to go about it? Maybe we need an impartial external force to investigate the government if they have nothing to hide and prove whether this is true or not.
You know, as I told you, our government is always open to, you know, cooperation. And, but what we need is, if they write something in the report,
yes,
do you think they have a proof that it is true? Because anyone can take something and write.
How do we know anything is true?
We need, if they want really to cooperate with us, with our government, we need the proof on all what they are saying in the report. This is the one thing. Secondly, if they really want to support a no-violent climate in our country, I think, and it is true, it is better for them and for us to investigate also on those, on the responsibilities of those people who are involved in this situation. Why they don't want to do that?
You don't want any external forces to investigate your country?
Sorry?
You don't want any external forces to investigate your country?
Why? For what? We have our forces who work day and night to, you know, to secure everyone in the country.
Ambassador,
and they do that very, very efficiently.
Has the government done anything wrong in the past 2 years?
I don't think so.
No?
I don't think so.
Nothing?
Nothing. Our government, it is the opposite. We are trying to, you know, we are helping other countries to bring the peace. You know, our forces are participating peacekeeping in Somalia, in
Central African
Republic, and everywhere in Darfur we have, you know, how can you? I come back to your previous question. How can you think that to bring external forces to help keeping peace in the country, which is helping other countries? It's unacceptable.
Don't those who are across the border as well in the camps deserve justice?
As I told you, they are coming back, but
and they must forget about
you
what
may note that now those who know that they committed crimes,
what about those who had crimes committed?
They don't want to come back.
What about those who had crimes committed against them? Those who are detailed in the report. Okay, let's take a tenth of what the UN is saying is true. Let's say only a tenth is true, right?
Yeah.
And say a small portion of women were raped, a small portion of innocent people were tortured. Don't they deserve justice when they go back home?
No, you know, our government is able to handle such kind of situation. You may know also, one very important thing. Our parliament, for instance, very recently, the parliament set up, implemented a commission to investigate on this report, to investigate on what is being spreaded in this report. And I can guarantee you that if this commission will find one or two truth on accusation, which is in this report, of course our government will react accordingly.
Okay. Ambassador Joel Nkurabagaya, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Police in Saudi Arabia have arrested at least 20 activists, including 3 prominent clerics who've been critical of the kingdom's policies. Most recently, the sanctions against Qatar. But is something bigger happening behind this crackdown on dissent? There are reports that King Salman is maneuvering the chess pieces to abdicate in favor of his son. It's not a far-fetched theory, given he took the unprecedented step of firing not just 1, but 2 crown princes to make his next of kin the heir apparent. So would that bode well for the future stability of Saudi Arabia? Joining me now to answer that question is Michael Stevens. He's in London, working as a Middle East Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. And here in studio is Ghalib Dalai, a research director at Asharq Forum. Gentlemen, good to have you both on the program. Michael Stevens, let me begin with you. Are we seeing a fast tracking of the succession plans?
I think we've already seen a fast tracking of the succession plans. First of all, with the removal of Crown Prince Muqrin, and then the removal of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef to put Mohammed bin Salman in place, unprecedented. The way in which the institution of the Crown Prince has been seemingly rode over by King Salman is quite unique. Not once, but twice. In the reign of Salman, which is only 2.5 years old. So we are definitely seeing a fast tracking, and it looks pretty certain that Mohammed bin Salman will be king in the near future. When that is exactly is difficult to know, but it is absolutely certain that he is accruing more and more power and being given more authority, and it looks like that will be the most likely future for Saudi.
Ghalib Dalai, is he the de facto king anyway right now, in practice?
Well, he is the de facto king in practice, and he is running most of the important institutions of the state. He is running most of the big projects, like Saudi 2030 ambitious economic development project. He's executing the war in Yemen. He's the chief architect of the crisis with Qatar. So he's basically the one that is running the regional policy. So he's de facto is running the institution of power in Saudi Arabia. But nevertheless, I think he still doesn't have his hand on all levels of power, particularly when it comes to the National Guard and the religious establishment. Yes, they are not opposing him outrightly, but what I feel and what I say is that he is basically having control almost in all aspects of the power level in Saudi Arabia, but not as much still yet around National Guard and the religious establishment.
So then I wonder, Michael Stevens, when we see in one fell swoop 3 prominent clerics get arrested along with other activists, and you have these guys, Salman al-Auda, Awad al-Qarni, etc., massive, big kind of superstar clerics, if you look at their Twitter followers and their videos and that sort of thing, right? When you see that happening, does it suggest that he's kind of doing housekeeping before he assumes the throne as he tries to grab hold of all the levers of power?
Yeah, I think what's important to note here is that clerics have always danced a dangerous game around power in Saudi Arabia, and there have been times before. Actually, in 2014, when King Abdullah also put pressure on clerics like Mohammed al-Arifi, who were expressing sentiments which were pro-Muslim Brotherhood, for example. And a number of clerics then, these superstar clerics with these millions of Twitter followers, were also told at that time that they needed to be a little bit quieter. But I think what's happened here is slightly different from 2014, in that you have a crown prince who doesn't have the history and the legitimacy yet to have power in all sectors, as Galip said, particularly in the religious establishment. Now, what you had with the sons of Ibn Saud, Abdullah, Faisal, and even King Salman, because he's been governor of Riyadh for many years, he had a close relationship with the religious establishment. He has the respect and the authority needed to be able to control them. Mohammed bin Salman doesn't have that. And of course, what you're seeing is some sort of maneuvering there to get that sort of power back. It's clearly got some political motivations to it as well. I think that there are certain belief systems that these clerics like Salman al-Auda have, which don't tie in exactly with what Mohammed bin Salman is trying to do. And so the best option is to keep them quiet. I don't know exactly how this will play out, whether they will be detained indefinitely or whether there will be some sort of message to them that they need to change their line in public. Certainly, I wouldn't put it past the Saudis to have some sort of conversation on that level. But I think you're absolutely right. They are trying to bolster Mohammed bin Salman's position, and one of the things they've got to do is take care of the clerical establishment.
Yeah, one of the reasons we're having this discussion is Saudi is so opaque, it's such a kind of riddle inside, a mystery inside an enigma, or I don't know in which order to put those words, but it is like that. Is the message generally, Galip, that if you have a following, if you're not against Qatar, if you're not against the Muslim Brotherhood, and if you are against the current war in Yemen, you might be locked up? Is that essentially the message?
Well, this is one of the messages, but I think like this is not the only reason behind this recent crackdown on the clerics, because we have seen it's like right now more than 20 clerics has been, detained. We're only knowing the name of the most famous one, but it's like, the number is larger than this. What I suspect, I mean, I don't know that, I still, that's not knowledge by any means, but what I suspect that we might see something like, accompanying the declaration of transition of power from King Salman to his son. When I say like, declaration, that might be, this talk of some kind of modernization, the Saudi social life, the Saudi political system. I suspect that King Mohammed bin Salman probably has some ambitions, also be, the person that will open the way in this regard as well too. So while going forward for this, some kind of like social modernization, I don't want to call the, I don't want to use the word secularization. I think this is one way of silencing the clerics. We have seen, for instance, in 1991, when there was during the invasion of Iraq, the first Gulf War, we have seen like Saudi Arabia taking some similar measures against the clerics. That the one that has not approved the Saudi Arabia joining the U.S. Joining forces with the U.S. against Iraq. So what I suspect here, yes, the Qatar is one reason. Yes, the war in Yemen is one reason. Yes, to get the clerics to condone the rise of Mohammed bin Salman is one reason. But I also suspect perhaps we are seeing something else that will be accompanying the rise of Mohammed Salman to the kings, that we might see him declaring some kind of a new structure. One structure will be towards the Mecca, Medina, the holy places, and another structure or the law or the procedure towards more like, the general Saudi Arabia. And these might create some kind of like trouble with the clerics. So I see this also a message to the rest of the clerical community in this regard as well too.
Based on all the available evidence so far in everything that he's involved himself in, whether it's with regards Yemen or internally or the hawkishness vis-a-vis Iran, what kind of king can we expect Mohammed bin Salman to be long term?
Well, I think at the moment, if we look at the track record of his policies, a lot of them haven't gone that well. It's pretty clear he's on a steep learning curve. You know, as you pointed out, he has a young team around him. I'm afraid to say that, you know, there's a reason that young decision makers don't generally get to the top in Western systems, and because they tend to be quite rash and impulsive, and wisdom comes with time and experience. You know, I'm 34. I would love to be an ambassador, but I don't think it would be possible in my system, for example. And there is a reason for that. And I think that ultimately what you have to say is that maybe time and experience will mellow him, and maybe he will understand that some of the policies he's taken, and we see it now with the sort of restructuring of the reform program. There's a little bit of realism creeping into some of that ambition that he had. It's clear he's a very ambitious young man. He wants to do a lot to reform the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and that's fine. Nobody is saying that that is the wrong way to go. It's just the realism of the policy. How do you implement it? What structures are you putting in place? How effective are those going to be? I'm afraid to say that hasn't gone so well. So for the moment, I think we need to say, you know, there's a little bit more of a learning process to go there. Let's hope that he has a good team of advisors around him that can guide him through that. But at the end of the day, you know, taking, you know, rash decisions like the one against Qatar, for example, or this war in Yemen, I think those are going to be black marks on his record. He's going to have to work hard to rebalance those. Okay, I've got to move on. It was fascinating demystifying Saudi Arabia a little bit with you gentlemen, Michael Stevens and Ghalib Dalai. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Next time, we'll debate whether a series of Russian war games is actually a smokescreen to invade Ukraine. Until then, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.